The distress signal. The emergency beacon from Kryn 7 flickered across the galactic aid network at 0600 Standard Time. In the sterile operations center of the Central Aid Coordination Facility, dozens of species monitored their screens with practiced efficiency. The Valorian shift supervisor, Telmora, examined the incoming data with her 4 eyes, each independently processing different aspects of the crisis. A mining accident on Kryn 7. Structural collapse in the primary extraction facility. Estimated casualties between 2,000 and 3,000 workers trapped beneath rubble and twisted metal. The oxygen supply in the sealed sections would last perhaps 40 hours if they were fortunate. Telmora initiated standard protocol. She compiled the request parameters into the system, watching as algorithms calculated the minimum necessary response. 3 rescue ships with specialized equipment, 1 medical frigate, perhaps 2 engineering teams if any were available. The system estimated a deployment timeline of 5 to 7 days, which was actually quite good by galactic standards. The Kryn were a peaceful species, methodical and careful. They had been mining the mineral-rich asteroids of their system for 3 generations without incident. This collapse was their first major disaster, and their own rescue capabilities were limited. They had emergency teams, certainly, but nothing designed for catastrophe on this scale. Telmora transmitted the aid request across the network to 47 member species. Then she waited. This was always the difficult part. Waiting for volunteers, negotiating logistics, arranging transport corridors. She estimated the first rescue ship might arrive at Kryn 7 in 6 days if everything proceeded smoothly. The humans received the notification 3 minutes after it was transmitted. Telmora knew this because her console immediately lit up with an incoming priority response. She blinked her eyes in sequence, confused. Priority responses were almost never used. They were reserved for species volunteering substantial resources or requesting clarification on extreme circumstances. She opened the communication channel. "This is Central Aid Coordination. Please state your response parameters." The voice that answered was crisp and female, carrying an edge of controlled urgency that Telmora had never heard in aid coordination before. "This is Commander Sarah Mitchell of the Terran Emergency Response Command. We are mobilizing Fleet Group 7 for immediate deployment to Kryn 7. Estimated time of arrival is 14 hours. Telmora's primary eyes widened. "Commander, I believe there may be confusion. The request is for 3 rescue vessels and medical support. Fleet Group 7 suggests a much larger deployment." There was a pause. When Commander Mitchell spoke again, her tone carried a hint of something Telmora would later identify as determination. "There is no confusion, Coordinator. We have 43 ships prepared for immediate departure. This includes 8 heavy rescue carriers, 12 engineering support vessels, 6 mobile hospital ships, 15 supply transports, and 2 command coordination cruisers." Telmora felt her breathing membranes flutter in shock. "Commander Mitchell, with respect, this seems highly irregular. The estimated need is for minimal intervention. Galactic protocol suggests that excessive aid can create dependency and disrupt local recovery efforts." "Coordinator, with respect, I don't care about protocols when people are dying." Mitchell's voice hardened. "We have examined the data from Kryn 7. The collapse created a debris field 3 kilometers wide. There are toxic gas leaks in sectors 4 through 9. The structural integrity of the remaining facility is compromised. Your estimate of 3 rescue ships is catastrophically inadequate." Telmora pulled up the data again, seeing it through new eyes. The humans were right. The standard algorithms had calculated minimum intervention, not optimal rescue parameters. "But Commander, the expense alone must be extraordinary. The fuel, costs for emergency speed transit across 3 systems, the resource deployment, the personnel commitment. This will cost your species millions of credits." "Then it costs millions of credits," Mitchell replied simply. "We're launching in 20 minutes. Please transmit all available structural data on the mining facility to our engineering teams." Mitchell out. The channel closed. Telmora sat in stunned silence, staring at her console. Around her, other coordinators had noticed the exchange. A Brenthian analyst approached her station, his scaled face showing confusion. "Did the humans just mobilize a military fleet for a mining accident?" he asked. They called it an emergency response fleet, Telmora replied, but her voice was uncertain. She pulled up the human database, scanning through their files. The Terran Emergency Response Command was indeed a civilian organization, but its structure, equipment, and personnel were all military-grade. The humans had apparently taken their entire military infrastructure and duplicated it specifically for disaster response. It made no sense economically. It made no sense politically. It made no sense by any standard calculation of resource efficiency. The Kryn received the notification of human deployment with similar confusion. High Administrator Ven stood in the Emergency Command Center on Kryn Prime, reading the message 3 times to ensure he understood correctly. "They're sending 43 ships?" his deputy asked, mandibles clicking in disbelief. "For a mining accident?" "Apparently," Ven replied. He felt a flutter of concern. The humans were a relatively new species to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 70 years ago. They were known for being aggressive, emotional, and strangely unpredictable. Some species found them unsettling. There were rumors about their homeworld Earth being classified as a Category 9 Deathworld, though Ven had always assumed such classifications were exaggerated. "Should we be concerned?" his deputy asked. 43 ships is an invasion force. "They claim it's a rescue force," Ven said, though his own uncertainty showed in his voice. "We have no choice but to accept the aid. Our people are dying." The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace above Kryn 7 exactly 14 hours after receiving the distress call. The Kryn monitoring stations registered the arrival with alarm. The ships that emerged were massive, industrial-sized vessels that dwarfed anything in the Kryn system. They moved with military coordination, taking up orbital positions with practiced efficiency. Commander Sarah Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Turks Determined, watching the mining colony grow larger on the main view screen. She was a woman in her late 40s, with silver streaking through her dark hair and the kind of lean, focused intensity that came from years of emergency response work. Around her, the bridge crew worked with calm efficiency, coordinating the deployment of resources that most species would reserve for war. "Status report," she commanded. Her operations officer, Lieutenant Chen, pulled up holographic displays. "All vessels in position, Commander. Rescue teams are prepped and ready. Engineering Corps standing by. Medical facilities are online and receiving data from the surface. Atmospheric analysis. Toxic gas concentrations are worse than initial reports indicated," Chen replied grimly. "Sectors 4 through 9 are completely contaminated. Oxygen levels in the trapped sections are critical. We have maybe 30 hours, not 40. Mitchell nodded, her expression hardening. "Then we move now. Deploy all rescue teams immediately. I want engineering drones mapping the entire debris field within the hour. Medical ships prepare to receive casualties. This is not a drill, people. Every minute counts." The first human rescue teams hit the surface of Kryn 7 within 40 minutes of arrival. The Kryn emergency coordinators watched in amazement as dropships descended in perfect formation, disgorging teams of humans wearing advanced environmental suits and carrying equipment that looked far too sophisticated for standard rescue operations. Kryn Emergency Chief Delic approached the first human team leader, a broad-shouldered man with captain's insignia on his suit. "I am Delic, Emergency Coordinator for this facility. We appreciate your assistance, but I must ask, why so many personnel? Our initial request was for minimal aid." The human captain removed his helmet, revealing a weathered face with kind eyes. "Captain James Rodriguez, Terran Rescue Corps. With respect, Chief Delic, your initial request drastically underestimated the scope of this disaster. We've analyzed the structural collapse. You have 3,000 workers trapped in a facility that's still actively failing. Minimal aid would mean you recover maybe 30% of them alive. We don't accept those numbers." "But the cost, the resources," Delic protested weakly. Rodriguez smiled, though his eyes remained serious. "Chief, humans come from a planet that actively tries to kill us. Earthquakes that level cities, hurricanes that tear apart coastlines, volcanoes that bury entire regions. We've been dealing with disasters for our entire evolutionary history. We learned a long time ago that when catastrophe hits, you don't send the minimum. You send everything you've got." He turned to his team. "Deploy the heavy lifters. I want structural supports on sectors 1 through 3 immediately. Engineering teams begin debris clearance using the predetermined grid pattern. Medical set up triage stations at coordinates Alpha through Delta.
Move, people, move!
The Kryn workers watched in stunned silence as the human rescue operation unfolded. It moved with the coordination of a military assault but the purpose of pure salvation. Massive machines descended from orbit. Mechanical giants designed to lift hundreds of tons of debris. Human engineers swarmed over the collapsed structure, placing support beams and stabilizers with frantic speed. And then there were the humans themselves. Delic watched as rescue workers ventured into sections of the collapse that his own people had declared too dangerous to approach. They crawled through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies, descended into shafts filled with toxic fumes, worked in areas where the structure groaned and shifted ominously overhead. "Are they insane?" his deputy whispered. "Those sections could collapse further at any moment." "I don't think they care," Delic replied quietly. He was watching a human woman, perhaps 30 years old, squeezing through a narrow gap in the twisted metal. Her team had detected life signs 30 meters into a section where the structural integrity was rated at 12%. Any Kryn engineer would have declared it a recovery operation, not a rescue. Too dangerous, too unstable. The mathematics of acceptable loss. But the human woman kept moving forward, her breathing steady over the communication system, her voice calm as she reported her progress. "I've got visual on the survivors. 4 Kryn workers trapped but conscious. Give me 5 minutes to clear the debris blocking their exit." 5 minutes later, she emerged with all 4 survivors, having somehow shifted enough wreckage to create an escape route. She was covered in dust and bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but she was smiling. 4 more safe, she reported. "Where do you need me next?" Delic realized something in that moment, watching the human rescue worker disappear back into the chaos. These weren't just rescuers. These were people who had been shaped by a world so hostile that disaster response was embedded in their very nature. They didn't calculate acceptable losses. They didn't consider the mathematics of resource efficiency. They simply refused to leave anyone behind. By hour 6 of the operation, the human rescue teams had extracted over 800 survivors. By hour 12, that number had climbed to 1,500. The Kryn medical facilities were overwhelmed by the sheer number of rescued workers arriving, so the human hospital ships had opened their medical bays, treating Kryn patients with equipment and techniques that seemed impossibly advanced. Commander Mitchell stood in the coordination center, monitoring dozens of feeds simultaneously. Around her, holographic displays showed the entire operation in real time. Red zones gradually turning yellow, then green as sections were cleared and stabilized. Life sign indicators showing saved workers, each one a small victory against chaos and entropy. "Commander, we're getting reports from the Galactic Aid Network," Lieutenant Chen reported. "Multiple species are requesting information about our deployment. They're calling it unprecedented." Mitchell didn't look away from the displays. "Tell them we're busy saving lives. They can analyze our methods later. Also, High Administrator Ven of Kryn Prime is requesting a direct channel. He seems quite insistent." "Put him through." The Kryn administrator's face appeared on the screen, his features showing a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "Commander Mitchell, I must speak with you about your deployment. The scale of your response, the resources you're expending, it goes far beyond anything we requested or expected." Mitchell finally turned to face him directly. "High Administrator, with respect, your request was insufficient for the crisis. We assessed the situation and deployed accordingly. But why?" Ven asked, and his voice carried genuine confusion. "The expense must be staggering. Your species gains nothing from this level of commitment. Why send 43 ships when 3 would have been sufficient by galactic standards?" Mitchell was quiet for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "High Administrator, do you know what a Deathworlder is?" "I have heard the term," Ven admitted. "Planets with extreme environmental hazards. Earth isn't just a death world, High Administrator. It's a Category 9. Our planet has tried to kill us in every way imaginable for millions of years. Weather that can destroy cities in hours, geological activity that can bury civilizations, diseases that can wipe out populations. We evolved in an environment where disaster is not an exception, it's the norm." She gestured to the displays showing her teams working. "Every person on those ships volunteered for this mission. Nobody ordered them. When they heard that 3,000 workers were trapped and dying, they didn't calculate cost-benefit ratios. They didn't consider resource efficiency. They thought about the people who needed help and they moved." "But surely your species has limits," Ven protested. Economic considerations, political realities. We have limits, Mitchell agreed. But they're not where you think they are. Humans will spend 1,000,000 credits to save a single life. We'll risk 10 lives to save one. It makes no sense economically. It makes no sense politically. But it makes perfect sense to us. She turned back to the displays. We're Deathworlders, High Administrator. We don't do small aid. We send fleets. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an operation to coordinate. The channel closed, leaving Ven staring at a blank screen, trying to understand a species that operated on principles his people had never considered. The Deathworlder Way. The rescue operation entered its 20th hour, and the impossible was becoming routine. Human teams had now extracted over 2,000 survivors from the wreckage of Crin 7, a number that the Crin emergency planners had never dared hope for. The mining facility that had been declared a tomb was transforming into a testament to human determination. Delic stood at the edge of the primary collapse zone, watching a scene that defied everything he understood about disaster response. A massive human machine, something they called a heavy lifter, was slowly raising a section of collapsed ceiling that weighed over 400 tons. Beneath it, trapped in a pocket that had somehow maintained structural integrity, were 47 Crin workers who had been given up for dead. The human engineering team leader, a woman named Captain Lisa Torres, stood nearby with her hand raised, controlling the lift with minute precision. Delic could see the concentration on her face, the absolute focus as she balanced speed against safety. One miscalculation could crush the very people they were trying to save. Steady, Torres commanded into her communicator. Lift rate at 0.5 meters per minute. Support beams, stand ready to deploy on my mark. Delic watched as other humans moved into position, carrying massive metal beams that must have weighed hundreds of kilograms each. They moved with practiced coordination, each person knowing exactly where they needed to be and what they needed to do. The ceiling section rose slowly, revealing the pocket beneath. Delic could see the Crin workers inside, their faces showing exhaustion and disbelief. They had been trapped for nearly 30 hours in darkness, breathing recycled air, certain they would die in that metal tomb. Support beams, deploy now, Torres commanded. The humans moved as one, sliding the massive beams into position with mechanical precision. Within seconds, they had created a stable framework that would hold the ceiling section in place even if the lifter failed. Medical teams, you're clear to enter, Torres announced. Extraction team, begin evacuation procedures. Nice and careful, people. We didn't come this far to lose anyone now. Delic watched as human medics entered the pocket, treating the Crin workers with gentle efficiency before guiding them to safety. Each survivor emerged blinking in the harsh work lights, alive because humans had refused to accept their deaths. How do you do this? Delic asked Torres quietly. How do you maintain such focus, such precision hour after hour? Torres removed her helmet, wiping sweat from her forehead. She looked tired, but her eyes remained sharp and alert. Training, Chief, but more than that, necessity. On Earth, we deal with disasters constantly. Every human learns disaster response in school. We practice evacuations, rescue procedures, emergency medical care. It's just part of growing up on a death world. But this level of coordination, the equipment, the resources, Delic gestured at the massive operation surrounding them. This goes far beyond basic training. Torres smiled slightly. You're right. But here's the thing, Chief. Humans have a saying. Fortune favors the prepared. We built all of this because we know disaster is coming. We just don't know when or where. So we prepare for everything. She pointed to the heavy lifter. That machine. We have thousands of them scattered across human space. The medical ships in orbit? We maintain a fleet of 200, fully staffed and ready to deploy within hours. Every human military unit trains in disaster response. Every civilian emergency service has military-grade equipment. Because on Earth, the line between war and natural disaster is pretty thin. A call came through Torres's communicator. Captain, we've got a problem in Sector 7. The western wall is showing stress fractures. Could collapse within the hour. We've detected life signs beyond it, maybe 30 workers, but accessing them means going through the compromised section. Torres's expression hardened. I'm on my way. She looked at Delic. Want to see how Deathworlders really work? Delic followed her to Sector 7, where a team of human engineers had gathered around a holographic display of the compromised structure. The western wall was indeed failing, massive cracks spiderwebbing across its surface. Beyond it, thermal imaging showed the heat signatures of trapped Kryn workers. Options? Torres asked. A young human engineer, barely into his 20s, spoke up. We could try to stabilize the wall with support beams, then cut through carefully. But the vibrations from cutting might trigger the collapse. Estimated success rate is maybe 40%. Other options? An older engineer, a man with gray hair and scarred hands, cleared his throat. We could use the demolition charges. Bring the wall down in a controlled collapse away from the trapped workers, but we'd need someone inside to place the charges precisely, and they'd be in the collapse zone when it goes. Torres studied the holographic display, her mind clearly working through scenarios. Delik felt his breathing membranes tighten with anxiety. Both options were dangerous. The logical choice by Kryn standards would be to attempt stabilization, accept the 40% success rate, and mark the remainder as acceptable losses. I'll place the charges, Torres said. Delik's eyes widened. Captain, you just said that position would be in the collapse zone. You could be killed. Could be, Torres agreed. But I've done this before. I know the timing, know how fast I can move. And controlled demolition gives those workers a 90% survival rate instead of 40%. The mathematics are simple. The mathematics say you're risking your life for a 50% improvement. Delik protested. That's irrational. Torres looked at him with an expression that was both patient and slightly amused. Chief, let me tell you something about humans. We're the species that climbs mountains because they're there. We jump out of perfectly good aircraft for fun. We dive to the bottom of oceans just to see what's down there. Rationality is relative, she turned to her team. Set up the charges. I'm going in. Have the extraction team ready to move the moment the wall comes down. Delik watched in horrified fascination as Torres suited up, checking her equipment with practiced care. She moved like someone preparing for battle, which in a way she was. A battle against physics and probability, against the universe's indifference to individual survival. She entered the compromised section carrying the demolition charges, her camera feed showing on the holographic display. Delik could see the cracks in the wall growing wider, hear the ominous groaning of stressed metal. Any moment, the entire section could collapse, crushing Torres beneath hundreds of tons of debris. But Torres moved with absolute confidence, placing charges at precise points on the wall's structure. Her breathing remained steady, her hands sure. She worked as if she had all the time in the world, even though death literally hung over her head. Last charge placed, she reported. Initiating timer. 30 seconds to detonation. I'm moving to extraction point. Delik watched the feed as Torres ran, her powerful legs carrying her through the debris field with remarkable speed. The timer counted down. 20 seconds, 15, 10. Torres dove through a gap in the wreckage, rolling to safety just as the charges detonated. The western wall came down in a perfectly controlled collapse, falling away from the trapped workers exactly as planned. Dust and debris filled the air, but when it cleared, the path to the survivors was open. Extraction team, go, Torres commanded, already getting to her feet. Medical, stand by to receive casualties. Within minutes, all 30 workers had been evacuated. Not one had been seriously injured. The operation had been a complete success, achieved because a human had been willing to risk everything for a mathematical improvement in survival rates. Delik approached Torres as she removed her helmet, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. You could have died. For workers you don't know, from a species you barely know. Why would you take such a risk? Torres looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Because they needed help and I could provide it. What other reason do I need? But your life has value, Delik insisted. Your skills, your experience, your future contributions. Any rational calculation would say you're worth more than the statistical improvement you achieved. Maybe by your calculations, Torres replied. But humans don't calculate the value of life that way. Every person matters. Every life is worth saving. We don't do triage based on economic efficiency or future potential. We save who we can, and we don't stop until everyone is safe or there's nothing more we can do. She looked at the rescued workers being loaded onto medical transports. My grandfather used to tell me a story. During one of Earth's great wars, human soldiers would risk their lives to recover the bodies of fallen comrades. Not for any tactical reason, not because those bodies had military value, just because those were their people, and they deserved to go home. Other species thought it was insane, this willingness to risk the living for the dead. But that's humans for you. We don't leave people behind. Commander Mitchell stood in the mobile command center that had been set up near the rescue site, reviewing the latest reports. 32 hours into the operation, and they had extracted 2,743 survivors. Another 150 were confirmed dead, killed in the initial collapse before rescue could arrive. Only 100 workers remained unaccounted for, and search teams were still combing through the debris looking for any signs of life. Lieutenant Chen approached with a data pad. "Commander, we're receiving complaints from the Galactic Aid Network. Multiple species are protesting our deployment as excessive and setting unrealistic precedents for future disaster response." Mitchell didn't look up from her reports. "Are all our people safe?" "We've had 15 injuries, none serious. No fatalities. And the Kryn survivors? 2,743 rescued so far. Medical estimates 98% will make full recoveries." "Then I don't care what the Galactic Aid Network thinks," Mitchell replied. "Our mission is saving lives, not adhering to their protocols." "There's more, Commander," Chen continued. "The Galactic Council is requesting a formal inquiry into our methods. They're specifically concerned about our willingness to put rescue personnel at risk. They're calling it reckless and inefficient." Mitchell finally looked up, her eyes hardening. "Reckless? We saved over 2,700 people who would have died under their minimal aid protocols. Tell the Council they can conduct their inquiry after we finish saving lives." A communication alert interrupted them. High Administrator Ven appeared on the screen, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood representatives from a dozen other Kryn officials, all wearing expressions of profound emotion. "Commander Mitchell," Ven began, his voice thick with feeling, "I wanted to speak with you directly. We have been monitoring your rescue operations, and we must confess we do not understand. Your people risk their lives repeatedly. They venture into conditions we would declare unsurvivable. They refuse to accept losses that we would consider inevitable. Why?" Mitchell considered the question carefully. "High Administrator, have you ever heard the full classification of Earth's environment?" "I know it is rated as a Category 9 death world," Ven replied. "That's the short version," Mitchell said. "The full classification is more specific. Earth experiences regular seismic events that can destroy entire cities, weather patterns that generate winds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour, temperature variations from 50 degrees below freezing to 50 degrees above comfortable. We have toxic plants, venomous animals, microscopic organisms that can kill in days. Our oceans have creatures that can swallow a vehicle whole. Our atmosphere occasionally spawns rotating columns of wind that tear apart everything in their path." She paused, letting that sink in. "Humans evolved in an environment that was actively hostile to our survival. We developed not just intelligence but adaptability, the ability to see a deadly situation and figure out how to overcome it. We learned to cooperate on a level most species never needed to, because individual humans are fragile, but groups of humans working together can overcome almost anything." Mitchell gestured to the displays showing her rescue teams. "Every person out there has trained for years in disaster response. Not because they expect to use those skills, but because on Earth, disaster is always one storm, one earthquake, one volcano away. We build redundancy into everything. We overprepare. We create response systems that seem excessive by galactic standards, because our standards were set by a planet that regularly kills thousands, despite our best efforts." Another official stepped forward. A Kryn engineer Delic recognized. "But Commander, the expense. We have calculated the cost of your operation. The fuel alone for emergency speed transit, the equipment deployment, the personnel salaries. You have spent more saving our workers than the entire annual budget of our colony." "Yes," Mitchell agreed simply. "But how can your species justify such expenditure? How can this possibly be sustainable?" Mitchell smiled slightly. "Because, engineer, we don't calculate the value of life in credits. When humans hear that people are trapped and dying, we don't pull up a spreadsheet to determine if saving them is cost-effective. We ask a different question. Do we have the capability to help? If the answer is yes, then we help. The cost is secondary, but what do you gain?" Ven asked, genuinely confused. "Your species has no strategic interest in Kryn 7. We have no resources you need, no political leverage you require. You gain nothing from this massive expenditure except our gratitude. High Administrator, let me tell you about the worst natural disaster in recent Earth history," Mitchell replied. "About a century ago, a massive earthquake struck one of our major cities. Buildings collapsed, infrastructure failed, Hundreds of thousands were trapped or injured. Within 6 hours, we had deployed 20 million personnel to the disaster zone. Military units, civilian emergency services, volunteers from across the planet. We spent billions of credits. We lost over 3,000 rescue workers in secondary collapses and aftershocks. But we saved 400,000 lives. She leaned forward, her expression intense. The city that was devastated? It wasn't a major political center. It wasn't economically crucial. It had no strategic value. But it had people. Millions of people who needed help. So we helped. Because that's what you do when you're human. You don't calculate the return on investment of a rescue operation. You calculate how many people you can save. Ven was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was subdued. I think I'm beginning to understand. Your species operates on principles that seem irrational by galactic standards, but make perfect sense in the context of your evolutionary history. You save lives because your survival has always depended on cooperation and mutual aid. Exactly, Mitchell confirmed. On Earth we have a saying, leave no one behind. It's not just a military motto. It's how we approach every disaster, every crisis, every situation where lives are at stake. We don't accept losses as inevitable. We fight for every single person until there's no hope left. The rescue operation concluded at hour 38. The final survivor, a Kryn maintenance worker named Krell, was extracted from a pocket deep in the debris field. He had been trapped for nearly 40 hours, alone in the darkness, breathing air that was 90% depleted. By every logical calculation, he should have died hours earlier. But a human search team, following up on a faint thermal signature that could have been equipment malfunction or residual heat, had refused to give up. They had cut through twisted metal for 3 hours, moved tons of debris by hand when machines couldn't fit, and finally found Krell unconscious but alive in a space barely large enough for his body. Captain Rodriguez personally carried Krell to the medical transport, refusing to hand him off to other rescuers. Delic watched the human captain, exhausted and covered in dust, gently place the Kryn worker on a stretcher and stay with him until the medics confirmed he would survive. That's everyone, Rodriguez reported to Delic. 2,842 survivors. 158 confirmed casualties. We've completed structural stabilization of the entire facility and left engineering drones to monitor for any secondary collapses. Your people can begin recovery operations safely now. Delic looked at the transformed disaster site. Where there had been chaos and death, there was now order and hope. The humans had not just rescued survivors, they had rebuilt structural integrity, established medical facilities, trained local emergency teams, and left behind equipment worth millions of credits. Captain Rodriguez, Delic said quietly, I must ask you the same question I asked Captain Torres. You risked your life repeatedly during this operation. You ventured into sections we had declared too dangerous. You worked for 38 hours with minimal rest. Why? Rodriguez smiled tiredly. Chief, let me tell you about my first disaster response. I was 19, barely finished with basic training. A hurricane hit my home region on Earth. Category 5 winds over 300 kilometers per hour. It destroyed everything. My family's home, my school, the hospital where I was born. Everything. He looked at the mining facility. But within hours, response teams arrived. Thousands of people, all working together to save lives and rebuild. They pulled my grandmother from the rubble of her collapsed apartment. They treated my father's injuries when the hospital was gone. They fed us, sheltered us, gave us hope when everything was lost. And I asked one of the rescuers why they came, why they risked so much for strangers. What did they say? Delic asked. She said, because someone would do the same for me. And I realized that's how humanity survives. We help each other. We save each other. Because we know that someday, we might be the ones who need saving. So when I heard about Kryn 7, I didn't think about cost or efficiency. I thought about those people trapped in the dark, and I remembered my grandmother being pulled from the rubble. And I knew I had to help. The human fleet began preparations for departure. Commander Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Determined, watching as ships broke orbit one by one. The operation had been a complete success by human standards. Over 95% of trapped workers saved, with minimal casualties among rescue personnel. The Kryn facility was stabilized and safer than before the collapse. But as her fleet assembled for the journey home, Mitchell received one final communication from High Administrator Ven. Commander Mitchell, On behalf of all Kryn, I must express our profound gratitude. You saved thousands of lives at enormous cost to your own species. We will never forget this. Just doing our job, High Administrator, Mitchell replied. I must also tell you that word of your response has spread throughout the Galactic Aid Network. Multiple species are questioning their own disaster response protocols. Some are calling your methods excessive and unsustainable. Others are suggesting that perhaps galactic standards need to be re-evaluated. Mitchell nodded slowly. High Administrator, I want to make something clear. We don't expect other species to adopt our methods. We understand that humanity's approach to disaster response is shaped by our unique evolutionary history. We're not trying to set new standards or criticize existing protocols. Then why come? Van asked. Why deploy such overwhelming force when it goes against all galactic norms? Because we can, Mitchell said simply. Because we have the capability, the resources, and the will to help when disasters strike. And because every time we save lives, we honor everyone who died before we learned how. Every disaster in human history, every earthquake and hurricane and flood, every person we couldn't save, they taught us how to save the ones who come after. This is how we remember them, by making sure their deaths weren't meaningless. She looked at her assembled fleet. We're Deathworlders, High Administrator. Our planet tried to kill us for millions of years. We survived by adapting, by cooperating, by never giving up even when the odds were impossible. So when we hear that people are dying, when we know we can help, we don't calculate the cost. We don't debate the efficiency. We just move. Because that's what Deathworlders do. We send fleets, Ven said quietly, finally understanding. We send fleets, Mitchell confirmed, every time, without hesitation. Because that's not excessive to us. That's just what you do when people need help. You send everything you've got. The communication ended. The human fleet entered hyperspace, leaving behind a saved colony and a galactic community that would never quite look at disaster response the same way again. The Kryn would remember that when they called for help, humanity didn't send the minimum. They sent everything, because that's what Deathworlders do. They don't do small aid, they send fleets. And somewhere in the darkness of space, the next distress signal was already being transmitted, waiting for the inevitable human response, waiting for the species that refused to accept losses as inevitable, that calculated the value of life and saved souls rather than spent credits, that would cross star systems and risk everything for strangers they'd never met. The Deathworlders were coming, and they were bringing everything they had.